Christopher Nolan's Odyssey was incredibly underwhelming. I didn't like it at all. This was not a faithful adaptation of Homer's epics. It's the Odyssey in name alone, but lacks the actual thematic and narrative substance from the poems. You don't take faith out of the Bible. You can't take fighting out of Dragon Ball Z. And you don't take the gods out of the Odyssey. And even more so, you don't deconstruct the main character of Odysseus from a cunning and determined man persevering against adversity to return home, to instead a man regretful of his actions that ultimately doesn't want to return home.
Okay, fine, I'm cool, I'm fine.
It completely misses the mark on the spirit of the poem. The injection of modernity and thematic tropes from our time really make this version of the Odyssey incongruent with itself. It shows sequences that, if you have some recollection and familiarity of the poems, you may enjoy. But if you actually pay attention to the way the characters conduct themselves and interact with one another, the movie contradicts itself. And then if you contrast that to how the story plays out in Homer's works, the details are missed and completely different. The world the movie presents you doesn't feel authentic, lived in, and real. The characters talk to one another as if they know there's people watching them in a movie theater. It often did not make diegetic sense. This was taking our 21st century, 2026 sensibilities and transposing it to a time and a world set several millennia ago. And the outcome was an awful and empty adaptation that for me was a frustrating movie experience. And even to try and give the movie some credit from an objective quality point of view, from a technical filmmaking standpoint, I'd be a bit more willing to concede on the craftsmanship of the movie, even though it doesn't do much for my overall impression of it. Some people will certainly like the visual aspects of the film. I saw it in IMAX, albeit not a true 70mm, but even then, I was not impressed with it visually. Maybe some of the cinematography and ocean sequences were good, possibly some of the framework of the characters and lighting can get some credit, and I can understand the appeal and praise Nolan gets on being very adamant on doing the effects for his movies practically. But I didn't find the giants, Cyclops, and monster impressive or compelling, especially with how they're shot. But again, I can see how this would be a positive for some folks with the film. Even the Circe sequence had some striking body horror effects and imagery. Didn't like her casting and depiction, but the visual element of her scene was one of the more interesting ones in the movie. Now, Nolan's audio mixing issues has been a known problem and criticism of his movies as of late, and it doesn't get any better here. A good amount of the dialogue was not easy to understand with how booming the score and soundtrack was. Also, the trade-off for making this rated R for a few F-words was not a good decision. There isn't any other aspect about the movie that warrants an R rating. Should have just been PG-13. The pacing of the movie is also clunky. It's non-linear storytelling, as it is in the poem, and as how Nolan likes to do his movies. But here, especially in the first act, the timing of the events was not easy to follow. You jump around quite a bit. It's not good at establishing where things are, how long it takes to get to a place, and how much time may have passed in between events. It does smooth out as the movie progresses through the second and third acts, but even then, to call them acts isn't entirely accurate. This version of the Odyssey doesn't tactfully interweave the telling of events as effectively as it does in the poems. This part of the film very much felt like a collection of isolated sequences and moments they're trying to adapt from Homer's work that are ultimately jumbled together. It's a lot of loosely connected scenes lacking a significant amount of narrative thrust to lead you in what's supposed to be Odysseus' triumphant return. But that part in the final chunk of the film ultimately falls flat and quite anticlimactic. With how much this adaptation deviates from the source material, I was quite checked out early on, and disinterested in any attempts for spectacle in the visual medium. The color palette was also pretty muted, brown, dark, and understated. There wasn't any opulence or grandeur. The film didn't look or feel larger than life. The desire to make the movie very grounded works to the movie's detriment as an adaptation. The locations of Ithaca, Sparta, Troy, Calypso's island, and Circe's home all look the same. Even the gates of Hades was underwhelming. Now, I wanted to talk about the film from a character and plot perspective. So, let's start off with the controversial ones. Elliot Page plays Sinon in this version of the Odyssey. And even though this character isn't in Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, he is referenced in Virgil's Aeneid. But Nolan's version of the character is very different from the one in that poem. Instead of being a voluntary part of the Trojan horse strategy to deceive the Trojans, he instead is completely unaware of the plan. And that part of the film just doesn't make sense. The film suggests that there are hundreds and maybe even thousands of Greeks left at this point in the war. Together, they build the very refined horse, and somehow Sinon is unaware of the plan. Even if you were to be charitable to the movie and say it only took the Greeks a few days to build the horse, there is no way Sinon doesn't find out about what it's for. And more so, it doesn't make sense for Sinon to be unknowingly left behind by his comrades. Once again, if you were to be very generous with the movie and say there were less than 10 ships among the Greeks left, it is nonsense to believe that all 10 ships were able to pack up, sail away in one night, all while Sinon was sleeping. But then also leave behind a battalion to stay in the Trojan horse long enough to where it sinks 50 to 75% in the sand, which itself would take weeks. And why would Odysseus' plan be to build it without wheels and on a part of the beach where it could sink in the first place? But more on Odysseus later. And with how the movie depicts it, the horse is discovered by luck alone, not by deliberate action and planning. In the Aeneid, Sinon is a proactive, willing, and voluntary part of the story. He deceives the Trojans by presenting himself as a betrayer and deserter of the Greeks. The mechanics for this character, even in the addendum poem of the Aeneid, work so much better than what they were doing in Nolan's Odyssey. It also doesn't help that the first scene you see of Elliot Page's Sinon is a very unflattering running scene. He doesn't look good. The running is very unathletic. Sinon was with his fellow Greeks at war for the past 10 years. He's grown up from a boy to a young man surrounded by soldiers. As many parts of the film, this depiction was not believable and immersion breaking. And this was in the first few minutes of the movie. I just have a hard time understanding why this was the end result. Nolan and his producers know the casting of Elliot Page was going to be very controversial, for reasons including but not limited to how his character was going to be involved in the story. So, if you know there will inevitably be pushback with Elliot Page's casting, why would you depict Sinon this poorly? You couldn't do another take to dial in his running technique? You couldn't stay faithful to the source material and make Sinon a better character? You could have even built from it with how important the movie wants to convey Sinon to be, and have his character be a placeholder for Telemachus. Odysseus wasn't able to raise Telemachus, so maybe he treats Sinon as a son, since he may never get to see his real one. And then through Sinon's willing sacrifice, the cost of war deeply impacts Odysseus in a way he hasn't felt before, to where now he's more shameful, fearful, and aversive to returning home. Again, I think that idea completely butchers Homer's poem. But since that's the kind of Odysseus the movie wanted to go for, they should have just done it in a better way using what was already in front of them, instead of ham-fisting and force-feeding the audience dialogue of how Odysseus believes Sinon to be the greatest warrior he's ever known, through an action Sinon didn't willingly or knowingly participate in. The Trojan horse just works by luck. Achilles also exists in Nolan's continuity, but he only gets a single sentence of a throwaway line of dialogue. Odysseus surely would have known about him, don't you think? You didn't need Sinon in this story, but what this version of the Odyssey does is mangle the character from the source material, and take away elements from Elpenor and Achilles to give you a hollow and forced plot thread that's supposed to be a pivotal part to the story, but just doesn't work. Next up, you've got Lupita Nyong'o's Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra. I'm gonna be saying this a lot, but this was a completely different character from the source material. Physically, Lupita looks nothing like Helen of Troy. Narratively, Helen and Clytemnestra are not supposed to be identical twins. It doesn't make sense for Helen to be the most beautiful woman in the world if there's another woman who looks exactly like her. That is nominally false. In the source material, Helen and Clytemnestra are sisters, but one is the daughter of Zeus, Helen, and the other the daughter of Tyndareus, that being Clytemnestra. It's a part of the mythology that's very weird, because Zeus rapes their mom Leda while in the form of a swan, and then Leda pops out eggs. Some scholars say 2 eggs, some say 4 eggs, with 2 children being the offspring of Zeus, Helen and her brother, and the other being the offspring of Tyndareus, Clytemnestra and her brother. As otherworldly as this origin is, the narrative implications for Helen would and could be that her beauty is divine and ethereal. That's why so many men want to woo her, and the Iliad expounds on this further. She chooses Menelaus, and all the other kings and suitors make a pact that should any harm befall Helen, and by proxy her husband, all the kings would unite to bring justice to the circumstances. I'm not a Greek scholar by any means, but a slight tangent here that I'd like to bring up is that taking away the gods from the story completely breaks it. In the precursor events of the Trojan War, Apollo and Poseidon are condemned and punished by Zeus after he uncovers the plot to overthrow him as the god king. Their punishment is to serve and live among the Trojans for 1 year, and by doing so, they build Troy's impenetrable wall. But as their year of punishment comes to an end, Apollo and Poseidon are mistreated by the king of Troy, and then they condemn the kingdom of Troy to destruction, both in immediate turmoil and the upcoming siege and downfall. The petty and chaotic squabbles and infighting of the gods are so intricately woven into the mythology. Often their disputes trickle over to the realm of mortals, just like how Paris acquires Helen. The goddess of discord, Eris, creates a golden apple to be given to the most beautiful, the fairest of the gods. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all compete for it, and their competition brings them to Paris, the shepherd, unaware that he's a prince of Troy. He ultimately gives Aphrodite the golden apple, and in return would receive the love and affection of the most beautiful women in the world. And guess who that is? Helen of Sparta, who would later become Helen of Troy. So in the Iliad, Paris goes to Troy. Although Helen is already married to Menelaus, Aphrodite's divine magic and sorcery make or compel her to fall in love with Paris. Not to the level of the One-Wish Willow and Obsession, because Helen has agency, but it does make me very reminiscent of that movie from earlier this year. I bring this up though because the events of the Iliad lead into the Odyssey. All the characters are supposed to have the context and experience of living and participating in the events of the Iliad. As it relates to Helen's character, she acknowledges that she willingly went with Paris to Troy, and shows some level of contrition for all that has transpired when she and Menelaus reunite. And although he intends to kill her after what she's done, he takes her back as his wife instead, largely because of her beauty. He doesn't scar or abuse her like Nolan's Odyssey suggests. She doesn't reduce Agamemnon's conquest to a matter of trade route acquisition, like Nolan's Odyssey does. She isn't flirting the line of disrespect of her king, her husband, who remarried her and spared her life. So collectively, with the inaccurate casting of Lupita as Helen and the off-putting behavior she has, I did not find it believable that this depiction of Helen is supposed to be the same one that lived through the events of the Trojan War in the Iliad. Her role as both sisters was so small anyway. Less than 5 minutes of actual screen time? Why continue with the controversial DEI casting when the requirements for rewards can be met with roles that are less controversial or fulfilled off camera anyway? The studio has spent close to, if not more than $500 million to produce and market this movie. You need as much of the general audience as you can get. The subversive and, dare I say, agenda-driven casting does not help, especially for a character that most people familiar with Homer's work already have an understanding and expectation of. The controversy and alienating of part of the audience and potential ticket holders is not worth it, especially for characters that aren't on screen for more than 5 minutes in a 172-minute movie. It was, once again, immersion-breaking, for a role so small and pretty much inconsequential to the events of the Odyssey. So miscast and mishandled. Now with Athena, I didn't like how she was depicted in this film either. Not a fan of Zendaya, but why make her look so plain? This was another miscast and a mischaracterization of the goddess. Alexandra Daddario would have been a better casting. You could have even given her Athena's gray eyes. The movie really plays with the idea of whether or not the gods are actually real. Sure, people in the movie have faith, but the actual involvement of the gods is basically non-existent. No Zeus, no Poseidon, no Hermes, no Apollo, no Helios, and Athena's presence is a stretch. You could actually interpret the fantastical elements of Odysseus' retelling of his journey as purely induced by his Lotus drug trip, and not the literal occurrence of what happened. On one hand, the film wants you to believe the world apparently has magic and mythological creatures, like Cyclops, giants, witches, sirens, monsters, and more importantly, gods. Thunder sounds mean Zeus, and storm on the sea means Poseidon, though they aren't seen at all in this movie. And to be more specific, only one god is seen in the movie. And seen might not even be what actually happens, because on the other side of the matter, the conclusion of the movie frames the retelling of events in such a way that Athena might not even exist at all. That Zendaya's Athena is just a projection of the trauma and regret that Odysseus caused in the siege of Troy, a pure figment of his imagination, rather than a divine being. Once again, not like how it is at all in the source material. Athena is heavily involved in the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey, not some dismissible bystander. The goddess of wisdom and war often champions Odysseus because she respects his wisdom, strategy, and cunning. Odysseus is her favorite mortal after all. In the poem, she is often helping Telemachus and Odysseus on their journeys. She pleads with Zeus to send Hermes to force Calypso to release Odysseus from her island. Calypso is not the sympathetic therapist the movie makes her out to be. Her conduct with Odysseus in the poem is way darker and selfish, keeping Odysseus on her island against his will, and taking advantage of him sexually. Nolan's Odyssey really tries to hide that element and reality of Charlize's Calypso, with the soft-spoken dialogue and change of heart that really comes out of nowhere. Now back to Athena. She also helps disguise Odysseus often on his journey, and also in the plot of his triumphant return. She also helps fight on his side when the suitors rise against him, and holds back the dawn, so he and Penelope can enjoy a nice long night for the reunion they've been waiting 20 years for. But in Nolan's Odyssey, Athena is reduced to an illusion, a projection of Odysseus' guilty conscience. The film is selectively mystical, picking and choosing parts of the source material that it wants to show for spectacle, but lacking the narrative context to make those sequences meaningful. The faith element in this movie is also odd. A huge plot thread of the film is the idea of honoring Zeus's law of hospitality, treating others the way you want to be treated. How Christian of Zeus. Is that in Homer's Odyssey? Nope. Nolan's Odyssey is not even consistent with this idea, and the consequences it likes to suggest that may happen if this law is violated. How is a violation of Zeus's hospitality determined? What are the parameters? No idea. Did the Trojans violate the law when Paris acquired Helen? If so, then was their downfall justified? If their downfall is justified, why does the movie frame the Trojan horse as something that violates Zeus's law? Odysseus is really shaken up about it. His regret for his involvement in the war is the whole reason why he doesn't want to return home. When does the offense of Zeus's law start, and at what point is the offense rectified? Who decides? Who gets to enact justice? Did Circe violate Zeus's law with Odysseus' men? Did Calypso when she willfully and intentionally held Odysseus captive on her island? Does the Cyclops violate the law when he eats Odysseus' men who are staying in his cave? Does Zeus's law justify the suitors squatting in Odysseus' home and the depletion of his resources? If not, then why would Odysseus be exiled for executing the justice of the gods?
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
There are a litany of narrative problems and inconsistencies with this huge plot point that didn't need to exist. It's not a thing in Homer's Odyssey. You know what else isn't a thing in Homer's Odyssey? The kind of man Odysseus is in this movie? Odysseus isn't ashamed or regretful of his Trojan horse strategy at all in the poem. He's not a man who is without faith either. He often goes out of his way to honor the dead and the gods, though in this movie it inconsistently depicts him as a man of faith, but then also as an atheist, and the kind of man that shows contempt for the gods. His dialogue and actions are irreconcilable to one another. Matt Odysseus delivers an okay performance. There wasn't anything moving or an elevation of the source material in my opinion. His character is not the respected and cunning strategist from Homer's epic. He is often disrespected and ridiculed by his own men. His right-hand man, Eurylochus, consistently and continuously goes against him. And it's not just in the dialogue, it's in the looks he gives Odysseus. He shows contempt for him, rather than respect and reverence. And that behavior extends to most of the battalion. Matt Odysseus soldiers don't convey the reverence and honor for the man who is their king and commander. This would have been a fine endpoint as you get through the chaos and calamity of the journey back home. The growing frustration, disrespect, and mutiny would make sense. But the movie shows that in the Siege of Troy, Eurylochus had an unimpressed expression when helping Odysseus back up. It starts with disrespect and ends with disrespect. The dialogue of the movie wants you to believe that he's respected and revered, but the characterization and events of the story do the opposite. Another note on Odysseus' men, the casting was not good. The racially diverse cast completely breaks my immersion. A black dude, an Asian dude, and an Indian dude are all Greeks from Ithaca? Not buying it. I also heard that the scene when the black soldier and Eurylochus are speaking to one of the villagers whose land they just pillaged, the villager was apparently speaking Greek, and yet Eurylochus doesn't understand him. Not sure how true that is, but it's comical and ironic if that's actually right. Now back to Matt Odysseus. This is a deconstruction of the original character, and it's not Odysseus at all. The movie did not do a good job at showing him as a cunning and superior strategist, especially when you think about the details for the Trojan horse mentioned before. The siege of Troy was also underwhelming because Odysseus and even Menelaus weren't depicted as great generals and commanders. They were flying by the seat of their pants. Okay, I'm being a little hyperbolic there, but the movie really could have benefited from not only having effective dialogue for Odysseus to create and convey the strategy, but also to call out battle formations and tactics while the siege was occurring. Moreover, the interaction with Polyphemus was also mishandled in Nolan's Odyssey. They completely removed the nobody subversion by Odysseus, and consequently failed to show some dynamism of his character, in that his hubris results in more turmoil when he reveals to Polyphemus his actual identity. In Homer's Odyssey, this resulted in Poseidon's direct involvement in tormenting Odysseus and his crew. Odysseus just can't help himself but boast after he outsmarts the Cyclops, and instead of a clean getaway, it leads to the doom of his crew. Nolan's Odyssey hinted at that hubris when the crew came across the sirens, but it was such a fleeting and short moment that you don't really get that part about his character nor understand it. Also completely different that he doesn't remember anything on Calypso's island. He's very adamant about getting home and remembers everything. His soldiers eat the Lotus Memory Plant, not him. And then with the Golden Rams, Helios is not a part of the plot at all. Helios doesn't threaten Zeus by telling him that he won't carry the sun across the sky if he doesn't do anything about Odysseus' men eating one of his rams. Nolan's Odyssey rushes through, condenses, and even removes the trials and tribulations Odysseus and his men go through. And those decisions don't make a better story. I also hated the dynamics of the reunion between Telemachus and Odysseus. Not only was the dialogue rough to get through, but it's completely different to the uplifting moment they have in the poem. They no longer meet in Eumaeus' tent, but instead meet in a temple of Athena. However, their reveal still doesn't happen. Nolan's Odyssey shifts it to occur right before the banquet, when Odysseus sees Argus. It's a compelling part of the movie, sure. As emotionally manipulative the abused and dying dog angle is, it's just not how it works in the poem. Odysseus is understandably emotional upon seeing his loyal hunting dog after 20 years. But in his determination to keep the ruse of his identity, he does not approach or pet Argus. Argus instead recognizes Odysseus from afar, and passes away peacefully, for he has finally seen the return of his master. Now in Nolan's Odyssey, when Telemachus discovers that the man who's been helping him is actually his father, it's an emotionally empty and hamstrung scene. It's in public, so they don't have the privacy of Eumaeus' hut to express their joy and affection. The interaction also doesn't make sense because they're talking about Odysseus' identity in front of their home, where other people have the chance of hearing them. The whole closing sequence really lost me, because Telemachus is not involved with the plot to eliminate the suitors at all. In Homer's epic, he and his father plot and scheme together. But in Nolan's story, Odysseus takes the majority of the weight of the strategy and execution of the strategy upon himself, standing contrary to the messaging the movie just told us of how he needs to let go and not be so controlling. But hey, we're trying to do the bow thing from the poem, just poorly. And then, instead of Telemachus and Odysseus triumphantly and violently eliminating all the suitors and servants who betrayed their family, Telemachus is just standing around for most of the fight, because apparently participation would violate Zeus's law. And then when he takes on Melanthius, it's a pitiful and cliche fight sequence. The movie wants to use it as a payoff for Telemachus' training scene from earlier, but it really falls flat. Nolan's Odyssey also shows plenty of deference and grace to the suitors who gave up in the fight, when in the poem, Odysseus kills them all, including the women servants who betrayed Penelope. But the movie conveniently omits showing and implying any of those consequences. The violence and combat of the fight is not satisfying or gratifying either. A few other things I wanted to mention. Agamemnon is an aura farming Batman bro, who immediately loses all of his aura the moment he speaks. John Bernthal was John Bernthal. Hated the costume he had when meeting Telemachus. It did not look good. Robert Pattinson was okay as Antinous. The movie was pretty ham-fisted and heavy-handed on telling and showing the audience of his cowardice. It was clear enough when they told us the first time. Didn't need to see that idea repeated 4 more times. Though I would have preferred if this adaptation took some more liberties on how Odysseus kills him. More violence would have been great, but the film hardly has any blood. Now, Hathaway was overall just alright. I did not like that Penelope wavered on her loyalty to Odysseus and ultimately gave up hope. She is incredibly steadfast and loyal in the poem. The modern-day feminist outburst she had in the final hour of the movie also does not make sense for a queen in that time period. Another example of modern-day isms that aren't aligned with the kind of world the Odyssey is set in. The unsophisticated and dumbed-down American dialogue was a big downside of this movie for me. It really takes away from the poetic grandeur, intrigue, and mysticism fitting for an epic of this time. I even rewatched Troy after my screening of the Odyssey, and although it also has plenty of problems from an adaptation perspective, it's a better movie, a better adaptation, and a more enjoyable time. I'm also very fond of the Spartacus series, and the Odyssey really would have benefited from that kind of dialogue.
So many hearts beating towards inevitable end.
Why did you call me here, Crassus?
Same reason you came. Curiosity.
And has it been satisfying?
We vexed each other for many months, both suffering grievous wound upon effort, yet have never broken single word.
There are none that would hold difference.
And that's the gist for my thoughts on the Odyssey. After sitting on it and writing my script for this review, I hate this movie. It's so different from Homer's poems and does not have the substance, heroism, and hope. I don't recommend this 3-hour movie. If you find the story interesting, just read Homer's work. I'm more familiar with Feigel's translation, but I have heard the Mendelssohn one balances the grandeur, translation, and literary writing style a lot more accurately. But there's also audiobook-style retellings that I've enjoyed on YouTube that you could check out too. If you made it this far in the video, I appreciate your time. Definitely let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'll catch you next time on The Gist.